Welcome to Platypus Economics. Last week, we officially launched with a video diving into the federal budget deficit. And today, we're going to respond to audience questions and comments related to that video. I'm Megan Connors,
I'm Justin Wolfers.
and this is The Professor is In. So, we had a lot of questions and comments about this video. In particular, a lot of people wanted to know more about interest payments. Who exactly is the government borrowing from, and where do those interest payments go? So, can you start off by explaining that a bit more?
Yeah. No, look, first of all, I just love that people were into it. We're talking about fiscal policy and people had all sorts of wonky questions. So thank you. Um, okay. So first of all, the government owes money. We borrow money because we take in less than we spend. You make up the difference by borrowing because all the contractors want to be paid. Fair enough. Where does that come from? The government can't just go to the bank because it went to a local bank and said, I would like to borrow several trillion dollars. Most banks can't do it.
Yeah.
So what they do instead, and the problem is the government's big and any one bank is small. So what they do is they go to the bond market. Now, what's the bond market? The government basically says, hey, I'm going to sell you a piece of paper. This piece of paper, I will give you $105 for this piece of paper in a year's time. How much are you willing to buy it for? And people might be willing to buy it for $100. All right. So that means now the government gets $100, but in a year's time has to give someone 105. That means the government just borrowed money, in that case at a 5% interest rate. Seems a very complicated way of doing things. Well, the reason we do it through the bond market is the government can sell that piece of paper to lots of different people and lots of different banks and lots of different financial institutions. So the fact that the US government is big doesn't really matter so much because now it's selling those pieces of paper or implicitly borrowing from people and institutions all around the world. All right, that's just the foundation. The question was, where do the interest payments go? Which is exactly the same as saying, who does it sell the bonds to? And here's the really interesting thing. Turns out, roughly speaking, I don't have the precise number, 2/3 of our debt, of the government's debt, is owed to Americans. That might really change how you think about things because you hear a lot of rhetoric that sort of sometimes it's almost nationalist tone, like we can't afford to owe this much money to China. Well, we don't. Actually, it's the American government owes it to the American people. And guess what? The American government is the American people. Huh. All of a sudden, it feels a whole lot less like a ton of other people have a ton of leverage over us. You could even go, if you want to get into the geopolitical part, what if the Chinese decided they didn't want to buy our bonds anymore? Well, first of all, they're not buying that many, so they're not lending us that much. And the other thing is the rest of the world's out there. As long as we're offering a pretty good interest rate, people like money, and so therefore they're going to come and lend to us rather than lend to someone else as long as we offer the right interest rate. So if China were to walk away, we might end up paying slightly higher interest. But remember, actually, the biggest lender to the American government is the American people.
We had a couple of people ask, like, can't the government just print money? And I think most people are aware that like there are downsides to printing money, but there are also downsides to higher interest payments. So how do those downsides like compare against each other and shake out?
Yeah, my son asked the same question, actually. He's 13. Points. He's a creative economic thinker, let's put it that way. But the president has put a lot of creative thinkers in charge, not necessarily who know more than my 13-year-old. Different question. There are two ways we could pay for this. Right? We could go out, borrow money, and use that to pay our contractors and public servants and all of that. We just print more money. It's true. We do own a big money printer. That would work. So think of these as just two alternative ways. And then the question is, what best serves the United States? So printing money sounds like it's free, but it's not. Sometimes when you fall down the intellectual rabbit hole of thinking about money, it's worth remembering at the end of the day, the economy is people and goods and services. And money just helps facilitate all of that.
Yeah.
And they're people and goods and services moving across space and across time. And so printing more pieces of paper doesn't in any fundamental level change the fact that we have only so many people and so much stuff and so much space. What does it do? Well, if you print more money, then there's more money chasing the same amount of goods. And the way that ends up working is the price of the goods goes up. And we've got a word for that. We call that inflation. So when we borrow money, we repay it from tax revenues, income tax, things like that, progressive taxes that hit the rich more than the poor and that are designed, we hope, in a sophisticated way. I understand there are problems. The other way of doing it is we print money. Printing money causes inflation. Inflation means that the money that's left in your wallet's now worth less. Implicitly, then you've just paid a tax. We can call that the inflation tax. And so now this brings everything into a like for like thing. Would we rather fund the debt with an inflation tax or income tax? The thing about an income tax is we can tax the rich more than the poor. The thing about an inflation tax is it taxes you in proportion to the number of dollar bills you have in your wallet. And so it might have very different implications. With an income tax, we can do things like create special carve outs where there are specific types of social policies we want to pursue, parts of the economy that we want to improve, and so on. The inflation tax will not be progressive, right? You can't charge a higher, different inflation taxes to different people,
Yeah.
different sectors of the economy, and so on. You might like it because it's kind of mechanical and it gets all of the political lobbying out of the way, but then there's a different problem, which is as soon as the government can do this, then you start worrying it will do it. And once it starts doing it, I know how much they're going to tax me this year, but what are they going to do next year? Now, all of a sudden, I've got a reason to stop holding on to money. And if people aren't willing to hold on to money, it becomes really hard to run an economy. You basically move back to a system of barter. And quite literally, if the inflation, this is what a hyperinflation is. Money is such a horrible asset that no one keeps it. And during a hyperinflation, what you do is you get paid, the dollars hit your wallet, and you immediately run to the shops and buy your groceries before the inflation tax eats it away. And so your whole life gets reorganized around avoiding the inflation tax. So look, when you've heard about this word hyperinflation, very, very high rates of inflation, it almost always starts with some genius tin pot dictator who says to himself, I know how to get out of this current fiscal problem. I'm going to print money, and it never ends well. The US government debt right now is about $31 trillion, which, Megan, I'm going to ask you to do some math while I keep talking. Can I do that?
Sure.
Can you divide that by 330 million people for me? And I'll keep talking. Um, because what people do is they take the debt and they divide by the number of Americans, and then they say, therefore, this is your share of the national debt. This is how much you owe. Is that a good idea? I know you're doing the long division, carry the 4, divide by 6, quadruple it. All right, Megan, we're back from calculating. What number do you have for me?
Roughly 94,000. A little shy of
That's not
100,000.
rough. If you're going to be rough, you'd say
Yeah,
100,000. That's precise.
roughly 100,000. Roughly 100.
Okay. Well, that sounds terrible. If you just told me I owe someone an extra $100,000, I feel awful, right? And you've
Yeah.
made me miserable. And all of a sudden, if I'm a fiscal hawk, I'm like, oh my goodness, would someone just fix the national debt? Now, here's the thing. It's not just 330 million people who'll pay that because I just had kids. I had them a little while ago, actually. I didn't just have them while you were calculating. Um, and my kids are going to have kids, and their kids are going to have kids. And all of those people can help pay that off.
Mm.
And so now all of a sudden, that $31 trillion could be paid off by literally a trillion people, if you think about all the future generations. Now, you might say, I don't want to. I don't want my kids and my grandkids and my great grandkids to pay that off. But that's a different question. And actually, a lot of people have an intuition, I don't want my grandkids paying this off. But actually, I disagree. You see, the thing is, we're not just going to give our kids the debt, we're also going to give them incredible assets. My kids, who haven't paid a dollar of tax in their lives, get to enter a country where we have a school system and roads and police and laws and courts, and we have set them up for success. So, yeah, they're going to get some of the bill, but they're also going to get some of the benefit. So I kind of feel okay about it. But so the important thing is when you and I are borrowing, we have to think about our lifetimes. And so it's
Yeah.
one person who has to pay, or, if you're in a partnership too, right? And we have to pay it before we die. But the government lives forever. And it's not just 330 million Americans, it's literally future generations. And that fundamentally changes everything. The government can boost its income really easy. All it has to do is raise the tax rate. The government can see any dollar anywhere in the economy and say, I'll have that. And so its ability to pay is much higher than its current revenue. The government has incredible assets. The government owns all the national parks. The government owns the right to tax anyone, any amount, anytime, anywhere, ever.
Are you
The government.
suggesting we sell the national parks? Is that what you're suggesting?
Um, I am suggesting that when you think about debts, you think about assets at the same time, and the national parks are part of those assets. Look, if you borrow, this is a similarity between the two. If you borrow a lot of money in order to make an investment that will yield future income that makes it easy to repay the loan, that's a good thing for you and I to do. That's what business loans are like. That's also a good thing for the government to do. And so if the government is investing in infrastructure that or early childhood education that will boost future incomes and therefore future tax revenues, that's fantastic. If the government's borrowing to repaint the bottom of a reflecting pool, that's not yielding future incomes. That's not making it easy for us to repay. Humans, our income over time, our annual income tends to rise till about our 40s and 50s. And then it starts to fall after and we retire and then it goes away and eventually gets awfully close to zero. The income to a government tends to rise and rise and rise and rise because we have economic growth. And so the government's ability to repay is continually changing.
Does the going off script a little bit, but does the,
We don't have a script, do we, Megan?
demographic I had questions. This is a new one, but does, like, the demographic shift, like, you know,
Yeah.
looks like we're about to
Mm.
start declining in population, does that change the way that you think about any of this?
In a super interesting way, and I'm hoping we might do some work on this, Megan. Because what we have is the president, of course, has cut back dramatically on immigration. And let me go back. Remember I said we have a debt and it doesn't have to be paid by the current set of Americans. It can be paid by a bunch of future Americans. If we don't have immigration and population growth, the number of people who can pay off that debt just went down. So that's a funny thing. Every immigrant who comes into the country inherits part of our debt
Mhm.
in a because they're gonna have to pay taxes here. So if you want the debt to be easy to repay, double the number of Americans. I'm not being funny. The economic burden of our debt is larger per American when we have fewer Americans. So yeah, I think this is fascinating. I think this is a big part of the immigration debate that we just haven't even begun to talk about yet. And partly it depends on who it is who's immigrating. So people who are 70 years old, if they immigrate, they're not going to have children and they're not going to work. So while they sound like they're part of the population, they're not paying taxes, so therefore they're not paying off the debt. But if people immigrate at age 20, we're not going to pay for their education. We're not going to pay for the hospital stay that led to their birth. But they're then going to spend their lifetime paying taxes. Hey, guess what? They just took on the burden of part of our future national debt, and it becomes easier on the rest of us. Fun question.
A lot to think about, and yes, I agree, I would love to pick that up in some of our future videos and content. Thank you so much for taking the time to answer these questions to our audience. We hope that you enjoyed this episode of The Professor is In. If you'd like Justin to answer your question in a future segment, you can leave a comment wherever you're listening to or watching this. And make sure to like and subscribe to Platypus Economics on YouTube, Substack, and pretty much any and all social media.